When my daughter told her friends I was just a distant relative, I felt something inside me break. I had flown over 2,000 miles, bought a brand new suit, and carried a gift I'd been saving for years, just to stand in the crowd at her graduation. I thought this trip would be the bridge to bring us back together. I couldn't have been more wrong. By the end of that weekend, I had learned two things. Some wounds never heal the way you hope, and silence can speak louder than any words. What she said, and what she refused to do, changed everything I believed about second chances. The moment she turned her back on a simple photograph, she also turned her back on the years I had spent trying to make it right. But this story isn't just about a father being rejected. It's about what happens when decades of guilt collide with the cold truth of indifference. It's about the long flight home with a gift that will never be opened. And it's about the moment I decided I would no longer beg for a place in someone's life if they had already shut the door. Stay with me until the end, because what happened next will make you question everything you think you know about family, forgiveness, and the cost of holding on too long. Richard Miller had always imagined that if there was ever a moment to close the gap between himself and his daughter, it would be a moment like this. At 62, his life was quieter than he ever expected it to be. Too quiet, in fact. The house in Ohio felt empty, stripped of the noise that used to fill it when Emily was a little girl. That was more than a decade and a half ago. Divorce had changed everything. For years, he told himself, it was all just temporary. The weekends he missed, the school plays he couldn't attend, the birthdays celebrated over the phone. Each absence was just another thing he'd make up for, next time. But next time had a cruel way of slipping further away. Now, standing in his modest kitchen with a travel mug of lukewarm coffee, Richard stared at the airline confirmation on his laptop screen. A round-trip ticket from Columbus to Seattle, over 2,000 miles. It wasn't cheap, but this wasn't about money. This was about presence. This was about showing up when it mattered most. He glanced at the small velvet box on the table. Inside was a delicate silver necklace with a tiny pendant that opened to reveal a photograph. Emily, at 6 years old, smiling wide, her arms wrapped around his neck. That photo had been taken at a park on one of the rare weekends he had her to himself. He remembered the way she laughed when the wind caught her hair, the way she insisted on swinging just one more time. That moment had been preserved in the pendant for years, waiting for the right occasion. This is it, he murmured to himself. The idea of attending her graduation had been equal parts excitement and dread. Emily's replies to his messages had been short, sometimes just a thanks or okay. When he told her he'd be there, she'd responded with, "Sure, that's fine." There was no exclamation mark, no warmth in the words. But Richard chose to focus on the fact that she hadn't said no. He booked the ticket anyway. The days leading up to the trip felt strange. He pulled his old navy blue suit from the back of the closet, a suit he hadn't worn in years. It was a little tight around the waist, but nothing a few adjustments couldn't fix. He polished his shoes until they shone. Every small detail mattered. He wanted to look his best, not for the crowd, but for Emily. In the evenings, he found himself pacing the living room, rehearsing small conversations in his head. Ask her about her plans after graduation. Remember to tell her how proud you are. Don't talk too much about the past. It'll only make things awkward. He wanted to keep things light, positive. He wanted her to feel comfortable, not cornered by memories she didn't want to revisit. Packing was almost ceremonial. In addition to the necklace, he packed a graduation card, handwritten, filled with words he wished he had said over the years. The kind of words that might have bridged the silence if only he'd known how to speak them sooner. The night before his flight, he barely slept. The house was still, but his mind wasn't. He replayed old moments. The first day he dropped her off at kindergarten, the last phone call they had after her 16th birthday. Each memory felt both close and far away, like looking through a fogged-up window. Morning came too quickly. Richard double-checked his bag, making sure the necklace was secure. He locked the front door and stood on the porch for a moment, looking out at the quiet Ohio street. It felt almost symbolic, like he was stepping out of one chapter of his life and into another. At the airport, the noise and movement were a sharp contrast to his stillness. He moved through security, clutching the velvet box in his jacket pocket as if it might somehow slip away. His boarding pass felt heavier than paper. It carried the weight of years of absence, of hope, of longing. As he settled into his seat on the plane, Richard looked out the window at the tarmac. The engines roared, and the ground began to fall away beneath him. He thought about how, in just a few hours, he'd be in the same city as Emily. He imagined seeing her in her cap and gown, smiling, maybe even hugging him. He imagined her eyes lighting up when he handed her the necklace. It wasn't just a gift, it was a promise. A promise that he was here now, that he wanted to be part of her life in any way she would allow. For the first time in years, Richard felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this trip would be the bridge he had been searching for all along. Maybe it was finally time for the distance, both the miles and the years, to shrink into something small enough to cross. As the plane cut through the clouds, Richard leaned back in his seat, unaware of the turbulence, both literal and emotional, that waited for him on the other side. In the weeks before his flight, Richard had tried to keep the communication alive. It wasn't much. Just short texts here and there, updates about his travel plans, gentle questions about her schedule. He thought maybe, if he kept things casual, it wouldn't feel forced. The responses came, but they were always brief. Okay, sure, that's fine. No exclamation marks, no follow-up questions, no hint of excitement. Richard read each one more than once, searching for tone that wasn't there. Was she being polite? Was she upset? It was hard to tell in text, but he convinced himself it was just her way. Young people didn't use long sentences anymore, he reasoned. One afternoon, he sent her a photo of the suit he planned to wear. "Dusting off the old navy blue for your big day," he wrote, adding a little joke about how he hoped it still fit. She replied hours later with a single word. "Nice." He stared at the screen for a while, feeling a pang in his chest. He reminded himself not to overthink. Maybe she was in the middle of finals. Maybe she was stressed about her future. There were 100 reasons she might sound distant, none of which had to do with him. Still, late at night, he found himself scrolling through old messages, comparing them to now. There was a time when she was younger that she'd write back paragraphs, telling him about a book she was reading, a funny thing that happened at school, or a problem she wanted advice on. Those days felt far away now, like postcards from another life. A week before the trip, he called her. The phone rang 4 times before going to voicemail. He left a message. "Hey, Emily, Just wanted to check in, see if there's anything special you'd like me to bring for your graduation. I'm really proud of you, kiddo. I can't wait to see you." She didn't call back. The next day, she texted, "Sorry, I was busy. No need to bring anything." Richard read it twice. He typed out a longer response, then deleted it. He didn't want to seem needy. Instead, he sent, "Got it. See you soon." The days ticked by. Richard busied himself with work around the house, tightening loose hinges, fixing a leaking faucet, tasks that kept his hands moving, so his mind wouldn't dwell too much on what he couldn't control. But the quiet moments had a way of creeping back in. He'd find himself in the living room, holding the little velvet box, imagining the look on her face when she opened it. 2 days before the flight, he sent one more message. "Landing Thursday evening. Should I take a cab from the airport, or will you have time to pick me up?" Her reply came the next morning. "I can pick you up if my schedule works. We'll confirm later." It wasn't a yes. It wasn't a no. It was somewhere in between, a gray area that left him both hopeful and unsettled. That evening, over a simple dinner of reheated pasta, Richard thought about the distance between them. Not just the 2,000 miles, but the kind you couldn't measure on a map. When Emily was little, she used to run to the door when he came home, her hair a wild mess, her small voice calling, "Daddy!" Now he couldn't even be sure if she'd meet him at the gate. Still, he chose optimism. He had to. If he started doubting her now, the trip would already be poisoned. So he told himself the same thing over and over. "She's busy. She's stressed. She'll warm up when she sees you in person." On the morning of his departure, his phone buzzed with a new message from Emily. "I can make it to the airport. See you there." Richard smiled faintly at the screen. It wasn't enthusiastic, but it was something. He imagined her there, waiting at arrivals. Maybe this would be the start of something better. As he zipped up his suitcase, slipping the velvet box into the inner pocket, he took one last look around his quiet home. The house felt heavier when he left it behind, as though it was holding all the years he'd spent waiting for moments like this. On the drive to the airport, he kept replaying her messages in his head. The words might have been short, but they were still a bridge, however narrow. And he was ready to cross it. He didn't know it yet, but the bridge he imagined was nothing like the reality waiting for him. The terminal was crowded, but Richard barely noticed the noise. His focus was on the ticket clutched in his hand, the gate number printed in bold, and the clock ticking slowly toward boarding. Every step he took toward that gate felt like a step toward something bigger, a possibility he'd been carrying for years. When the boarding announcement finally echoed over the speakers, he rose from his seat, his old leather carry-on slung over his shoulder. He walked down the jet bridge, heart heavier than his bag. On the plane, he settled into his seat by the window. As the engines began their deep, steady rumble, Richard looked out at the tarmac. This was more than just a flight. It was a chance to rewrite years of absence. In his mind, he pictured Emily in her cap and gown, her smile breaking wide when she spotted him in the crowd. He imagined her walking toward him, arms outstretched, the gap between them, both physical and emotional, closing with each step. He held on to that image as the plane began its slow roll toward takeoff. As the aircraft lifted off, the Ohio landscape dropped away beneath the clouds, replaced by endless stretches of sky. Richard leaned back in his seat, letting the hum of the engines fill the silence. He closed his eyes, but instead of sleep, memories came. He remembered the day he and Emily's mother signed the divorce papers. Emily was 9. She had been quiet that day, retreating to her room, her stuffed animals lined up in a row on her bed, as though they could form a wall against the changes happening around her. Richard had wanted to stay close, but work took him elsewhere. He picked up long shifts, out-of-town contracts, anything that meant he could keep sending child support, keep the lights on for her. He told himself that being absent physically didn't mean he wasn't present as a father. But over time, he began to see how wrong that was. The missed school plays, the dance recitals he only heard about afterward, the birthdays he celebrated over scratchy long-distance calls. Each moment was a small cut, and together they made a wound that had never fully healed. Back then, he believed there would always be more time, that one day, when things were calmer, he could make up for all of it. Now, more than a decade later, he was still chasing that moment. The flight attendant came by, offering coffee. Richard accepted, the warmth of the cup grounding him in the present. He looked around the cabin, watching other passengers, some reading, some sleeping, some watching movies. They all seemed at ease, moving from one place to another, as if it were just a routine. For him, this was anything but routine. Somewhere over the Midwest, he pulled the velvet box from his jacket pocket. The silver necklace inside caught the light as he opened it, the tiny photograph staring back at him. Emily's small face, her laughter frozen in time, her arms locked around his neck. He traced the edge of the pendant with his thumb. That was the last summer they'd spent an entire week together. He had taken time off work to drive her to a state park, just the two of them. They'd gone fishing, roasted marshmallows, and stayed up late looking at the stars. It was the kind of week that felt endless in the moment, but far too short in hindsight. He closed the box carefully, tucking it back into his pocket as though the act could keep the memory safe. The captain's voice broke through his thoughts, announcing their altitude and estimated arrival time. 2 hours to Seattle. 2 hours until he stepped into a moment he'd been imagining for months. He pictured the arrival gate, her waiting, maybe holding a small sign as a joke, or maybe just standing there with that uncertain smile she used to give him when she was little. He imagined the first hug, the small talk in the car, her laughter over dinner. He told himself not to expect too much, but hope had a way of ignoring logic. As the plane began its slow descent toward the west coast, Richard looked out the window again. Below, the clouds broke open to reveal a sprawling city framed by mountains in the distance. His pulse quickened. Seattle looked beautiful from above, fresh, alive, full of promise. It made him think of the future he hoped to build with his daughter, even if it started small. A coffee after the ceremony, a photo together, a promise of more calls, more visits. The landing gear thumped into place, and the plane shuddered slightly as it touched down. Richard exhaled, his hand instinctively brushing the velvet box in his pocket. 2,000 miles, one flight, one chance. He told himself this was it, the moment to finally turn years of absence into something that looked like connection. The moment Richard stepped off the plane, he felt the familiar rush of airport energy. People rushing to connections, the sharp scent of coffee from crowded kiosks, the sound of wheels rolling over tile. His eyes scanned the crowd at the arrivals area, searching for a face he'd been picturing for weeks. And then he saw her. Emily stood near a pillar, her phone in hand, glancing up occasionally. She looked older than the girl in his memory. Of course she did. Her hair was longer, her posture straighter, her expression composed. Richard's heart surged. He raised his hand in a small wave as he approached. "Emily," he said, his voice warmer than he expected it to be. She looked up and gave him a small smile. Not wide, not rushed, just a polite curve of the lips. "Hey, Dad." The words were there, but the tone was flat. Richard tried to ignore the sting. He stepped closer, hesitating just a second before leaning in for a hug. She accepted it, lightly, her arms barely pressing against his back. "It's so good to see you," he said as they pulled away. "Yeah, you too," she replied, already glancing back at her phone. They began walking toward the baggage claim. Richard tried again. "You look amazing, Emily. That color really suits you." "Thanks," she said, her eyes still on her phone. He searched for another way in. "How's everything going? Big day tomorrow." "It's fine. Just a lot to do." The words landed like closed doors. Each question he asked, each compliment he offered, seemed to slide past her without catching. Richard forced a smile, telling himself not to read too much into it. She was probably tired. Graduation was stressful. At the baggage carousel, they waited in silence. Richard glanced at her out of the corner of his eye, studying the subtle differences. She had her mother's sharp cheekbones now, a confidence in the way she stood, but there was something else too, a kind of distance that felt more than physical. His suitcase appeared, and he pulled it off the belt. "Thanks again for picking me up. I wasn't sure if I should just grab a cab." "It's fine," she said simply. They walked to the parking garage, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the concrete space. Richard tried once more to bridge the gap. "I remember my graduation day, nerve-wracking, but I think I was more worried about my tie being straight than the actual ceremony." Emily gave a small laugh, more of an exhale than anything else. "I'm sure you'll look fine in your tie tomorrow," she said, a trace of humor in her voice, but her eyes still on the road ahead. Richard caught that little spark and held on to it. It wasn't much, but it was something. In the car, the conversation drifted in and out. She asked about his flight, and he gave her the short version. He asked about her plans after graduation, and she replied vaguely about looking at options. Each answer was like a pebble skipping over water, never sinking deep enough to make ripples. As they pulled up to his hotel, Richard felt the weight of the trip pressing on him in a way he hadn't anticipated. This was supposed to feel like the start of something better. Instead, it felt like stepping onto a bridge that was still under construction. One wrong step, and it might collapse. "Thanks for the ride," he said, forcing brightness into his voice as she parked. "Tomorrow's the big day. I'll be there early." "Okay," Emily said. She gave him a quick nod, her hand already reaching for her phone again. Richard stepped out, his suitcase rolling behind him. He watched her car pull away, the taillights disappearing into the evening traffic. Standing there in front of the hotel, he took a deep breath. Maybe she just needed time. Maybe the ceremony tomorrow would warm her up. But as he walked inside, a small seed of doubt began to settle in his chest, quiet but insistent. The morning of the ceremony, Richard woke before his alarm. The hotel room was still dark, the faint hum of the air conditioner filling the silence. He lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, letting the reality of the day settle in. Today was the day he had been waiting for. Not just the graduation itself, but what it represented. A chance to be part of Emily's world again, even if only from the edges. He dressed carefully. The navy blue suit fit snugly. His tie knotted with the precision of someone who wanted everything to be just right. He slipped the velvet box into his inner pocket, its weight both comforting and heavy. The campus was buzzing when he arrived. Clusters of students in caps and gowns laughed and posed for photos. Families stood in small groups, holding flowers and balloons, their voices full of pride. Richard walked through the crowd, scanning for Emily, but he didn't see her. That was fine, he told himself. They'd meet after the ceremony. He found his seat in the audience, somewhere in the middle section. The view wasn't perfect, but it didn't matter. He was here. That was what counted. As the processional music began, a hush fell over the crowd. Richard straightened in his seat, eyes fixed on the line of graduates filing in. Then he saw her, Emily, walking tall, her gown flowing with each step. For a moment, everything else faded. It was just her, his little girl, now a grown woman, moving forward toward her future. His eyes stung unexpectedly, and he blinked quickly, a smile pulling at the corners of his mouth. He thought about the long nights he'd spent working overtime, the missed milestones, the years he couldn't be there the way he wanted to. But all of it seemed worth it in this moment. She had made it. She was here, and he was here, watching her. When her name was called, Richard leaned forward, his chest swelling with pride. She stepped onto the stage, shook hands with the dean, and accepted her diploma. The applause filled the hall, and Richard's hands joined in, the sound almost drowned by the pounding of his own heart. As she crossed the stage, he instinctively raised his hand, ready to wave, to catch her eye. But she didn't look his way. Her gaze stayed forward, her expression composed, focused on the line ahead. Richard let his hand fall back into his lap. It didn't matter, he told himself. She was probably nervous. There were 1,000 faces in the crowd. She couldn't possibly look at all of them. Still, he couldn't help but hope for just a glance, some small acknowledgement that she knew he was there. The ceremony continued. Name after name, diploma after diploma. Richard stayed in his seat, applauding for each graduate, but his thoughts kept circling back to Emily. The image of her crossing the stage replayed in his mind, each time tinged with the pride he couldn't shake. When the last graduate had been called, the dean addressed the class, congratulating them on their achievements. The crowd erupted in cheers as the graduates turned their tassels. Richard clapped until his hands ached, the moment feeling both grand and personal. Balloons floated into the air outside as families poured out of the auditorium. Richard stayed seated for a moment, letting the crowd thin. He wanted to find Emily, but he didn't want to fight through the chaos. Eventually, he stood and made his way toward the exit. The sun was bright outside, the lawn crowded with graduates posing for photos. Everywhere he looked, there were proud parents snapping pictures, hugging their children, laughing together. Richard scanned the crowd, searching for Emily again. He caught glimpses of her, just the back of her gown, the edge of her cap, before she disappeared into another group of friends. He stopped for a moment, taking it in, even if she didn't see him, even if she didn't look his way. He had been here. He had watched her cross that stage. That mattered. Pride settled in his chest, steady and quiet. It wasn't the kind of pride that needed recognition. It was the kind that came from seeing someone you love accomplish something important, even if you were just a shadow on the sidelines. He turned toward the crowd again, hoping maybe, just maybe, this was the moment she'd see him. Outside the auditorium, the air was filled with the sound of celebration. Graduates posed in clusters, caps tilted at jaunty angles, tassels swinging in the breeze. Proud parents leaned in close for pictures, capturing moments they'd treasure for years. Richard stepped into the sunlight, scanning the crowd. He finally spotted Emily a short distance away, surrounded by friends in their black gowns. She laughed at something one of them said, the sound sharp and quick. He hesitated, not wanting to interrupt, but this was what he'd come for, this moment. Making his way through the crowd, he called softly, "Emily!" She turned, her smile fading just slightly when she saw him. "Hey, Dad," she said, her voice even. "You were amazing up there," Richard said, his own smile genuine. "I'm so proud of you." "Thanks," she replied. Her eyes darted briefly back to her friends, who were watching the exchange with polite curiosity. Richard took a breath. "Do you have a second? I thought we could take a picture together, just you and me, to remember the day." Emily's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. She glanced at her friends again, then back at him. Maybe not right now," she said carefully. He blinked, unsure he'd heard her right. "Just one quick picture," he tried again, keeping his tone light. "It'll only take a second. It's just—" She shifted her weight, her fingers fidgeting with the tassel of her cap. "I don't want my friends to feel awkward, you know, with the whole situation." The words landed like stones in Richard's chest. He forced a chuckle, hoping to diffuse the discomfort. "Awkward? It's just a picture." "I know," she said quickly, her tone apologetic but firm. "But maybe later, okay?" Richard swallowed, the weight of her refusal settling in his chest. He could feel the sting behind his smile, but he refused to let it show. "Sure. Later." Emily gave him a small nod, then turned back to her friends, the conversation picking up again as if nothing had happened. Richard stepped back, giving them space. He watched as she laughed with them, the sound carrying easily over the hum of the crowd. She looked happy, comfortable. It was the same smile he'd seen from the audience, one that never quite reached him. He moved toward the edge of the lawn, finding a quieter spot near a row of trees. Parents were snapping selfies with their children, grandparents holding bouquets, siblings draping arms over shoulders. It was a sea of connection, and he stood on its shore. He pulled out his phone, scrolling briefly through the pictures he'd taken during the ceremony. Most were from a distance. Emily on stage, Emily in line, Emily in the crowd. None of them were the kind of picture he'd hoped for. He told himself it didn't matter. What mattered was that she was happy, that she was surrounded by people who cared about her. That was enough. But as he watched her from a distance, a quiet ache settled deeper. He'd imagined this moment so many times. The two of them standing together, her leaning into his shoulder, both of them smiling for the camera. It wasn't about the picture itself. It was about what it represented, the chance to be seen as her father. A voice inside whispered that maybe he was asking too much, that maybe being here at all was already more than she'd expected from him. He stayed on the sidelines, pretending to check his phone, occasionally glancing up to make sure he could still see her. She moved effortlessly between groups, posing for photos, Her cap tipped back just enough for the sunlight to catch her hair. At one point, she looked in his direction. Their eyes met briefly, and she gave a small wave. It was something, but it wasn't the moment he'd hoped for. When her friends began to disperse, Richard considered approaching again, but she was quickly pulled into another conversation. A family nearby offered to take a group photo for them, and she gladly joined, the strangers smiling warmly as they snapped pictures. Richard turned away, the rejection still echoing in his chest. Walking toward the far side of the campus, he found a bench and sat down. The sounds of celebration felt more distant here, muffled by the rustling leaves. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and exhaled slowly. He told himself to be patient. Maybe later, as she'd said. Maybe after the crowds thinned, after the excitement settled. Still, the moment gnawed at him. It wasn't just about a photograph. It was about what the photograph symbolized: belonging, acknowledgement, connection. The refusal felt like a door, gently but firmly closing in his face. The bench was cool beneath him as he sat in silence, the small velvet box in his pocket pressing against his chest. He hadn't given her the necklace yet. He wanted the right moment, a private moment. But now he wondered if that moment would ever come. The crowd eventually began to thin, families heading to restaurants, graduates drifting off to celebrations. Richard rose from the bench, scanning the lawn one more time. Emily was nowhere in sight. He checked his phone. No new messages. As he walked back toward his hotel, the sun dipping lower in the sky, he tried to hold on to the pride he'd felt during the ceremony. She had graduated. She had succeeded. That mattered more than anything. But beneath that pride, there was an ache, a quiet, stubborn ache that whispered this trip might not go the way he had hoped. The first crack in his optimism had formed. Richard returned to his hotel room after the ceremony to change into something a little more comfortable for the dinner Emily had mentioned. He told himself it was a good sign she'd invited him at all. Despite the awkwardness earlier, there was still the evening ahead. He swapped his suit jacket for a neatly pressed shirt, straightened the cuffs, and took one last look at the velvet box resting in his bag. Not tonight, he thought. The dinner wasn't the right place. He'd wait for a quieter moment. The restaurant was a bustling place near campus, full of graduates and their families celebrating. The sound of clinking glasses and bursts of laughter filled the air. Richard spotted Emily at a long table toward the back, surrounded by friends and a few parents he didn't recognize. "Dad, over here," she called, giving him a small wave. Richard's heart lifted. It was the warmest greeting he'd had all day. He walked over, offering polite handshakes to the other parents, smiling at her friends. They all seemed friendly enough, if a bit curious about him. Emily gestured to an empty seat near the end of the table. The conversation at the table was lively, but Richard found himself mostly listening. Emily was busy talking with her friends, their chatter rapid and full of inside jokes. Occasionally, she'd glance his way, offering a quick smile or a small comment. "Did you try the bread? It's good," before turning back to the group. Richard sipped his water, content to let her enjoy herself. This was her night. He didn't want to intrude, but every now and then, he felt the quiet pang of distance, the reminder that he was more spectator than participant. When the entrees arrived, Richard decided to try again. "Emily," he said, leaning slightly toward her, "after dinner, Maybe we could finally get that picture together. Emily hesitated, her fork pausing midair. Maybe later, she said, her voice low. Richard forced a smile. Of course. No rush. The words sounded casual, but inside, he felt the same small twist he'd felt earlier. It wasn't the refusal itself. It was the pattern. Always later. Always some vague future moment. As the meal went on, he tried to focus on the food, which was excellent, and the conversation, which flowed easily around him. But he couldn't help noticing how naturally Emily interacted with everyone else. She laughed freely with her friends, leaned in to hear one of their parents tell a story, even posed for a group photo when someone suggested it. Richard found himself glancing at his phone, scrolling aimlessly through old pictures just to have something to do with his hands. In one photo, Emily was 5 years old, sitting on his lap at the county fair, cotton candy in one hand and her other hand clutching his shirt. She'd been so open then, so eager to be near him. A round of applause broke out at the table as one of Emily's friends made a toast. Richard raised his glass along with everyone else, but his thoughts were far away. As dessert arrived, Emily finally turned to him. Thanks for coming tonight, Dad. I know it's a lot of people, and you've had a long day. Richard smiled, seizing the moment. It's been wonderful. I wouldn't have missed it. And maybe tomorrow or sometime soon, we can get that picture? Emily shifted slightly in her chair, her smile tightening. Yeah, let's see. Tomorrow's kind of busy, but maybe later in the week. The words landed heavier this time. Richard nodded, hiding the sting behind a sip of water. Of course, whenever works for you. The table erupted into another round of laughter as someone told a joke Richard didn't catch. Emily joined in, her face lighting up, her shoulders relaxed. Richard sat back, watching her, caught between pride and a quiet ache. He told himself it was fine. She was young, surrounded by her friends, in the middle of a milestone moment. Maybe she just needed space. Maybe later, as she kept saying. But as the dinner wound down and people began gathering their things, Richard felt the faint weight of another missed moment settling in his chest. He shook hands with the other parents, thanked them for their kindness, and gave Emily a gentle hug before stepping out into the cool night air. The restaurant noise faded behind him as he walked back toward his hotel. It wasn't just that there was no photo. It was the sense that every time he tried to step closer, there was a polite but firm barrier, soft enough not to be called rejection, but strong enough to hold him at a distance. He told himself to be patient, but as he reached the quiet of his hotel room, that patience felt more like resignation. The following day, Richard decided to keep a low profile. He didn't want to intrude on Emily's plans, but hoped they might find a quieter moment together. The morning passed without a message from her. In the afternoon, she sent a short text. Heading to a post-grad party tonight. You can stop by if you want. It's at a restaurant downtown. It wasn't exactly an invitation filled with warmth, but it was an opening, and Richard took it. That evening, he arrived at the restaurant, a lively place full of chatter and clinking glasses. The private room in the back was already packed when he stepped in. Graduates were everywhere, laughing, hugging, posing for photos. He spotted Emily near the center of the room, her cap and gown long gone, replaced by a sleek dress. She was laughing with a group of friends, her energy bright, magnetic. Richard made his way in slowly, pausing at the edge of the crowd. He didn't want to interrupt, so he lingered by the bar, waiting for the right moment to approach. That was when he heard it. A voice, casual, curious. "Hey, Emily, who's the guy by the bar? The one in the blue shirt?" Richard froze. Emily's reply came quickly, her voice lower, but still audible over the music. "Oh, him? He's just a distant relative. Someone who used to help my mom out." The words hit Richard harder than he expected. Just a distant relative. For a moment, the noise of the room seemed to fade, replaced by a dull ringing in his ears. He stood still, the words replaying in his mind. He had crossed 2,000 miles for this moment. He had imagined being introduced as her father, maybe even with a note of pride. Instead, he was reduced to a vague footnote in her life story. Richard's hand instinctively went to the velvet box in his pocket, as if to steady himself. The necklace suddenly felt heavier. He took a slow breath, telling himself not to overreact. Maybe she was embarrassed. Maybe she didn't want to explain the complicated history to her friends. It didn't have to mean what it sounded like. But the words clung to him. From his spot at the bar, he watched her laugh at another joke, watched her friends glance over at him with mild curiosity before turning back to their conversations. He felt like a shadow in the room, present but unnoticed. When Emily eventually made her way toward him, she was smiling, her tone breezy. "Hey, glad you made it. Have you gotten something to drink?" "Not yet," Richard said, keeping his voice steady. "Well, feel free to mingle. I might be bouncing around a lot," she said, already glancing over her shoulder as someone called her name. He nodded. "Of course. This is your night." She gave him a quick smile before heading back into the crowd. Richard stayed where he was, nursing a glass of water. The conversations around him blurred together. Talk about job offers, travel plans, memories from the past 4 years. He felt both proud and painfully aware of how little he was part of these conversations, how far away he was from the version of Emily who laughed so freely among her friends. At one point, he stepped outside for air. The cool night hit his face, grounding him for a moment. He thought about turning back to his hotel, skipping the rest of the evening. But something in him resisted the idea of leaving without at least saying goodbye. When he returned inside, Emily was posing for another group photo. She didn't see him watching from the doorway, her laughter mixing with the click of the camera shutter. He stayed until the crowd began to thin, until Emily was less surrounded. She came over briefly, giving him another hug, quick, polite. "Thanks for coming tonight, Dad," she said, her tone smooth, as if the earlier words he'd overheard had never been spoken. Richard held on to that word, Dad, but it felt different now. On the walk back to his hotel, the city lights blurred slightly in his vision. He tried to focus on the positives. She had invited him. She had called him Dad at the end of the night. But beneath those thoughts, the echo of just a distant relative lingered, steady and sharp. Back in his room, he sat on the edge of the bed, pulling the velvet box from his pocket. He opened it, staring at the photograph inside. Emily, at 6 years old, her arms around his neck, her smile unguarded. That was the girl he remembered. That was the connection he had been holding on to. He closed the box slowly, placing it back in his bag. Maybe the right moment to give it to her would come, or maybe it wouldn't. For the first time since arriving, he felt the quiet shift from hope to something heavier, a realization that no matter how far he'd traveled, some distances couldn't be closed by a single trip. Richard left the party earlier than he'd planned. Emily had been swept back into the crowd, her laughter echoing faintly as the door closed behind him. The cool night air hit his face, crisp and quiet, a stark contrast to the warm, noisy room he'd just stepped out of. He walked slowly through the city streets, the hum of traffic in the distance. The restaurant lights grew smaller behind him until they disappeared entirely. His steps felt heavier with each block. Back at the hotel, he sat on the bed without turning on the lights. The room was dim, the hum of the air conditioning filling the silence. He loosened his collar, staring at the floor for a long time. This wasn't how he imagined the trip would end. He had pictured the two of them sharing a meal, laughing about small things, maybe even talking about the past, not to dwell, but to heal. He had imagined leaving with the sense that some gap had closed, even if only a little. Instead, he felt like an observer, like someone who had shown up to a story that had already been written without him in it. The next morning, Richard checked out of the hotel in silence. Emily hadn't suggested meeting before his flight, and he didn't ask. There was no goodbye breakfast, no promise of a visit soon, just the quiet reality that whatever connection he'd hoped to strengthen hadn't taken root. At the airport, he moved through security on autopilot, his thoughts fixed not on the lines or the gates, but on the quiet weight in his chest. He bought a coffee he barely drank, checked his phone more than once. No message from Emily. When his flight was called, he boarded without hesitation, finding his seat by the window. The plane was half full, the hum of conversation low. As the aircraft taxied onto the runway, Richard looked out at the city disappearing in the distance. He tried to think of the trip in terms of moments. Her walking across the stage, her small wave from the crowd, her voice calling him dad at the party. But the other moments, the refusals, the distance, the overheard words, pressed heavier on his mind. The engines roared, and the plane lifted off. Richard leaned back in his seat, the seatbelt tight across his lap. He stared out at the clouds, his reflection faint in the window. He thought about the years since the divorce, how every phone call, every holiday card, every text had been his way of trying to close a gap that kept stretching wider. He had believed that effort mattered, that intention could bridge absence. But intention wasn't the same as presence. And presence, he was realizing, didn't guarantee connection. Somewhere over the Midwest, the flight attendants rolled past with the drink cart. Richard declined, shaking his head with a small smile. He wasn't in the mood for small comforts. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and touched the velvet box. The necklace was still there, unopened, unoffered. He had brought it with the hope that it would be a symbol, a way of saying, "I'm here now. I've always wanted to be here." But he hadn't found the moment. Or maybe the truth was harsher. The moment had never been there to find. The clouds outside shifted, patches of sunlight breaking through. Richard stared at the light, thinking about how far he'd traveled and how little had changed. For years, he'd carried the idea that if he just showed up at the right time, said the right words, did the right thing, the past could be softened. But the past wasn't a knot to be untangled. It was a wall, built slowly over years, brick by brick. And now, sitting 30,000 feet above the ground, he was beginning to see that some walls weren't meant to be climbed. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, steady and unchanging. Passengers around him scrolled through movies, dozed off, or chatted quietly. Richard leaned his head against the window, closing his eyes for a moment. It wasn't anger that he felt. Not really. It was something quieter, something heavier. A deep, steady ache that came from the realization that he had been trying to claim a place in someone's life who didn't see him there. Hours later, the plane descended into Ohio. The familiar fields came into view, a patchwork of greens and browns beneath the gray sky. Richard sat straighter, his hands folded loosely in his lap. When the wheels touched down, there was no sense of relief, just the quiet acceptance of being home again. As he stepped off the plane, the terminal felt both familiar and strange, as if he'd left with one version of hope and returned with another, smaller, sharper, but truer. The captain's voice broke the quiet hum of the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be beginning our descent into Columbus shortly. Please fasten your seatbelts and ensure all devices are in airplane mode." Richard adjusted his seatbelt, glancing out the window at the shifting clouds. Ohio was somewhere below them, familiar and steady, a place that had always been waiting for him, no matter how far he traveled. He should have felt comfort in that thought, but there was only a dull heaviness in his chest. The plane tilted slightly, the engines lowering in pitch. He reached into his pocket, intending to silence his phone completely. But as the device came alive in his hand, a notification lit up the screen. A message. The sender's name wasn't Emily's. It was unfamiliar. He frowned, unlocking the phone. The text read, "Hi, Mr. Miller. This might be strange. I'm a friend of Emily's. I hope it's okay to reach out. I just had to ask. Are you Emily's father?" Richard stared at the words, momentarily unsure how to respond. His first instinct was confusion. Why would a friend of Emily's even need to ask that? Before he could type a reply, another message came through. "I honestly thought you were maybe a relative on her mom's side. Emily never mentioned you. Some of us thought maybe you'd passed away years ago." Richard felt his stomach tighten, the air in the cabin suddenly thicker. Never mentioned him. Thought he was dead. He read the messages again, his mind replaying Emily's casual words at the party the night before. Just a distant relative. He took a slow breath, typing back carefully. "Yes, I'm her father." A pause. Then the reply came. "Wow. I didn't mean to make things awkward. It surprised me. Emily's great, but she never talks about you. I guess I just assumed." Richard stared at the screen, his thoughts moving in slow, deliberate circles. Emily hadn't just avoided introducing him as her father that night. She had erased him from the version of her life she shared with others. Not absent out of circumstance, but absent by omission. The realization sat heavy in his chest. He typed back a short reply. "Thanks for letting me know." The friend responded once more. "I didn't mean anything by it. Just wanted to say, she looked happy you were there, even if she didn't show it much. Maybe that counts for something." Richard set the phone face down on his tray table. His reflection stared back at him in the darkened screen, quiet and still. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane descended through a bank of clouds. The view outside the window blurred with streaks of white, then cleared to reveal the familiar patterns of farmland below. He leaned back in his seat, the hum of the engine steady, and let the weight of the messages settle. For years, he had told himself that absence was something you could make up for, that if you just showed up at the right moments, the rest would fall into place. But now, 30,000 feet above the ground, he understood something deeper. Sometimes absence becomes a story of its own, and sometimes the person you were absent for learns to live in a version of life where you simply don't exist. The truth wasn't loud. It didn't shout. It was quiet, heavy, a slow, sinking realization that took its time. The flight attendants moved through the aisle, checking seat belts, collecting trash. Richard looked out at the horizon, the fading sunlight casting long shadows over the land. Ohio was close now. Home was close. But some things felt further away than ever. As the plane descended, his phone buzzed once more. This time, it was silent after. No more words from Emily's friend. No new messages from Emily herself. Richard slipped the phone back into his pocket and sat quietly. The muted hum of the engines, the only sound. He thought of the necklace in his bag, still unopened, still waiting. It had traveled 2,000 miles with him and back again, never finding the right moment. The landing gear lowered with a steady thump, and the plane shuddered slightly as it began its final approach. Richard sat straight, hands resting on his knees, feeling the subtle shift of gravity as the aircraft dipped toward the runway. The runway came into view, lights glowing against the dusk. The wheels hit the ground with a jolt, the engines roaring in reverse. The plane slowed, taxied toward the gate. Passengers unbuckled, reached for their bags, chatted about dinner plans or connecting flights. Richard stayed seated for a moment longer, letting the crowd move ahead of him. When he finally stood, he carried his bag quietly, stepping off the plane into the terminal. The familiar smell of home surrounded him, but it felt different this time, less like a return, more like the end of something he had been carrying for a long time. The ride from the airport to Richard's small house in Ohio was quiet. The taxi driver made polite conversation about the weather, the construction on the highway, the usual small-town topics, but Richard only half listened. His mind was elsewhere, still circling around the words from Emily's friend, the silence from Emily herself, and the reality he'd been avoiding for a long time. When the car pulled up to his driveway, he paid the fare, grabbed his bag, and stepped into the stillness of his home. It felt exactly as it had before he left, neat, orderly, but with an emptiness that seemed to echo. He set his bag down by the couch, pausing for a long moment before unzipping it. Inside, tucked carefully in the side pocket, was the small velvet box. He pulled it out, holding it in his hand. The necklace was still perfect, the photograph inside unchanged. Emily's 6-year-old face smiled up at him, arms looped around his neck. He traced the edges of the pendant with his thumb, feeling the familiar weight in his palm. Slowly, he closed the box and placed it in the top drawer of his desk. It wasn't a rejection. It wasn't an abandonment of hope. It was simply waiting for a moment that might never come, but no longer carrying it like a burden. Richard sat in his chair for a long time, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Then, almost without thinking, he reached for his checkbook. For years, he had sent Emily financial support, sometimes as gifts, sometimes as help with expenses, even when she hadn't asked. It was his way of showing he cared, of trying to stay connected in the absence of regular calls or visits. But as he looked at the checkbook now, he felt something shift. He wasn't angry. He wasn't bitter. But he realized he'd been giving without ever being invited to give, hoping the gesture would be enough to bring him closer. That had to change. He closed the checkbook, placing it neatly back in the drawer. From now on, if Emily needed help, she knew how to reach him. but he would no longer offer pieces of himself into a silence that didn't return the echo. The decision felt lighter than he expected. It wasn't a punishment. It was a boundary. A quiet line drawn not out of resentment, but out of self-respect. The next few days passed in a kind of still calm. Richard spent time in his garden, trimming back overgrown shrubs, pulling weeds that had crept in while he was gone. The physical work was grounding, the earth cool beneath his hands. One afternoon, he drove into town and stopped by the local Veterans Hall. He hadn't been there in years, though he was still a member. Inside, the familiar scent of wood polish and old coffee brought back memories. A few familiar faces looked up as he walked in. "Richard Miller," someone called from the back of the room. "Thought we lost you to the quiet life." Richard smiled. "Guess I've been too quiet. Figured it was time to change that." He joined a table where a few old friends were playing cards, listening to their easy banter, the conversation flowing as naturally as it always had. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about where else he should be or what he should be doing to prove himself. In the evenings, he began walking through his neighborhood again, something he hadn't done much since his retirement. The air felt different at dusk. The sky streaked with color as porch lights began to flicker on. He stopped to chat with neighbors he hadn't spoken to in months, finding a quiet satisfaction in the simple routine of connection. The absence of constant thoughts about Emily didn't mean he cared less. It just meant he was no longer defining himself by how close or far he was from her approval. One Saturday, while cleaning out his garage, Richard found an old box of photographs. There were pictures of Emily when she was little, of family trips, of birthdays and Christmas mornings. He sorted through them slowly, setting aside a few he might frame. It didn't hurt the way it used to. The memories felt warm, even if they belonged to a part of life that was gone. That evening, as he sat on his porch with a cup of coffee, the sun dipped low over the horizon. The air was still, quiet except for the hum of crickets. He thought about how far he had come, not in miles, but in the quiet acceptance that sometimes the best thing you can do for someone you love is to stop trying to force your way into their life. He still hoped Emily would call. He still hoped there might be a moment in the future where the necklace would leave the drawer. But for now, he was okay with the life he had, with the people who wanted to be part of it, and with the quiet respect he was finally giving himself. For the first time in years, Richard didn't feel like he was waiting for his life to start again. It was already here. The summer had settled into a steady rhythm. Richard's days were filled with small, ordinary things, the kind of things he had once overlooked in the years he spent chasing something just out of reach. He worked in his garden most mornings, joined the Veterans Hall every Thursday night for poker, and on Sundays, he went fishing at the lake with a couple of old friends. His phone sat on the kitchen counter, used more for weather checks than for calls. Weeks turned into months. The necklace stayed in the desk drawer, still waiting. Emily had not called, and he had not reached out. Not in silence born of anger, but in a kind of quiet understanding that if she wanted him in her life, she would know where to find him. It was a warm afternoon in late August when the unexpected happened. Richard had just returned from the grocery store, a paper bag of produce on the counter, when his phone buzzed. The sound was so ordinary, but something about it made him glance over quickly. The screen lit up. A message from Emily. He wiped his hands on a dish towel, his pulse quickening as he picked up the phone. Dad, can I come see you? The words were simple. No explanation. No details. Richard stood there for a moment, reading them again. The afternoon light streamed in through the kitchen window, dust motes drifting in the air. His first instinct was to question. Why now? What happened? But he didn't type any of that. Instead, he stared at the 3 dots on the screen as if another message might appear. None came. He thought back to the night in Seattle, to the overheard words, to the messages from her friend. He thought about all the moments he had wanted her to reach out, and now she had. But the message was a door only half open. He didn't know what was on the other side. He typed back slowly. Of course. When were you thinking? A few minutes later, her reply came. This weekend, if that's okay. Richard felt a strange mix of anticipation and caution. The old version of himself would have filled the silence with plans, questions, eagerness. But now, he kept it simple. That works. I'll be here. When the phone went quiet again, he set it down on the counter. His reflection stared back at him in the darkened screen. Older, steadier. Not the man who had flown 2,000 miles hoping for a perfect moment. Over the next few days, he went about his routine. But there was an undercurrent to everything he did. He cleaned the spare bedroom, not because he knew she would stay, but because it felt like the right thing to do. He stocked the fridge, made sure the lawn was neat. Friday night, he sat on the porch, the cool air carrying the sound of crickets. He thought about what he would say when she arrived. He thought about what she might say. He also thought about the possibility that she wasn't coming to reconcile at all. Maybe she needed something. Maybe there was a crisis. Or maybe she just wanted to see him, and nothing more. For the first time, he realized he was okay with not knowing. Saturday came, the hours moving slowly. Richard kept himself busy, watering the garden, sweeping the porch, making a fresh pot of coffee. The sky shifted from morning gray to afternoon blue, the sun steady overhead. And then sometime in the late afternoon, his phone buzzed again. A short message. On my way. Richard felt something stir in his chest. Not quite hope, not quite fear, but something alive. He walked to the desk and opened the drawer. The velvet box was still there, the necklace untouched. He held it in his hand for a moment, weighing it, the cool metal warm against his skin. Then he closed the drawer without taking it out. The sound of tires on gravel pulled his attention to the driveway. A car door shut. Footsteps approached. Richard stayed by the window, watching as the figure came into view. Emily, standing there, looking almost exactly as she had at graduation, and yet somehow different. He didn't rush to the door. He didn't prepare words in his head. Instead, he opened it slowly, the late summer air brushing past him. "Hi, Dad," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it was there. Richard met her gaze, searching for the answer to 1,000 unasked questions. He didn't find them. Not yet. "Hi, Emily," he said simply. They stood there for a moment, the space between them filled with everything unsaid. And then, without another word, Richard stepped aside, holding the door open. Emily walked in. The rest was unwritten.